Hello, my name's Kristyn, and I'm really excited and honored to be speaking to you today. So thank you, Catherine, and others for organizing this and for inviting me to share a little bit about the work that I'm doing. So I'm a farmer, and I'm out here in California's Central Valley, and I grow mostly Korean and East Asian herbs and vegetables. And I also grow commercial seed for Kitazawa Seed Company. And so I'm going to share a little bit just about sort of the nature of the seed work that I do, and a little bit about just what informs that work. So I'm just going to do this slideshow. So I always like to start, this is a quote from Ursula Le Guin from her Earthsea trilogy. And it's just about a young wizard in training, basically learning a little bit about some plants. And so the older wizard, the mentor, tells them, when you know the fourfoil in all its seasons, root and leaf and flower, by sight and scent and seed, then you may learn its true name, knowing its being, which is more than its use. What, after all, is the use of you or myself? Is Gaunt Mountain useful or the open sea? And so I'm just a big sci-fi and fantasy nerd, I guess. And but really this quote really gets at a lot of what drives, my relationship to a lot of the plants that I work with, and what anyone who kind of comes through the farm or that I work in collaboration with, what I trust they're bringing to it as well, which is just that sense of what we like to see in relationship is this sense of really seeing and understanding the full being of something. And sort of too often what that contrasts with in the type of society we're living in is understanding something just for maybe one facet of its prism, one sense of its utility. And so what I like to imagine and what drew me to doing seed saving work is really this desire to see things held in a much richer way and to really embrace all beings in their more full capacity. So I just like to kind of start with that. I like to work Ursula into as many presentations as is possible. So here's a picture of my farm. And again, yeah, we have that sort of dry, long Mediterranean climate through most of the growing season. There's no real off season for us. We grow year round. And so it's a blessing and a curse, I guess. But I'm primarily a fresh market producer. My farm is 10 years old, and I had been working on just other small scale diversified vegetable operations for probably another 10 years or so before that when I was younger. And so, yeah, my background has mostly been in just growing fresh produce and selling that mostly direct to consumer through farmers markets or CSAs. And I also have a partnership with a restaurant in San Francisco where we grow things exclusively for them. And we also go and work back and forth. They've done a lot of work in partnership with us in terms of some different plant breeding projects. So it's a great relationship. And we also have a small CSA that gets some of the other produce. Some more pictures of the farm. And for a couple years, probably like 7 or 8 years ago, I started doing field trials for Kitazawa Seed Company, which is based here in the Bay Area in California. And they're 104 years old. It's always been a Japanese American owned seed company. And so pretty remarkable considering all the things that company has endured in that century of operating. And so I had done field trials just to kind of try out different varieties that were being introduced through the seed company and see how they worked for small scale growers. And also just kind of see how they were received in the market. And a few years ago, I got the opportunity to start a seed line through them called Second Generation. And that seed line, my desire was to really focus on different heirloom varieties and to develop seed resources that were really suited and designed for small scale farms, that are organic, that are using very minimal types of inputs, and just things that we're going to be more capable of thriving, just given the state of our various environments. And so we release different varieties of our crops through second generation, and are just building that into a more collective resource that works with other growers, to just build not just a sort of seed resource, but also just have more information and have more ability to tell our own stories and our own narratives, and evolve those narratives moving forward with some sense of agency within the Asian diaspora. So kind of the main point to us is that this idea that cultural diversity is necessary in maintaining and building biodiversity. So I think a lot of times, like when we talk about Asian crops, like maybe people think it's about a sense of nationalism, or being ethnocentric, or it's about identity politics. And certainly like all of those things may carry some truth, but it's also just about what we risk to lose when we're not honest about the worldviews and perspectives that have been shaping in this more modern iteration of who is doing a lot of plant breeding and the consolidation of these seed companies, just what worldview that serves, what types of political systems that serves, and how that does impact biodiversity. And as much as we all know the sort of crisis we've experienced of how much genetic information and genetic diversity has been lost at a seed level, just saying that we're at risk of losing much more if we're not critical about the perspectives that are holding and working to restore and maintain that, because those things have always gone hand in hand. So we want to just point to the fact that human and plant communities have always really shaped each other's existence, and we want to just maintain that. And we do that just by asking a simple question of how does our sense of what's delicious, beautiful, or useful enhance or diminish plant communities? And so we just want to start by sharing a couple plant stories, because I feel like there's just ways that what plant communities have endured and continue to endure and what they're subjected to really mirrors a lot of what our different communities also experience. So here we have a couple different varieties of Perilla. And Perilla in the West, according to Western taxonomy, is classified as a single species genus, Perilla frutescens. And, in more recent years, like here you have this grid and you see Kenip and Akashiso, Tieto, Oba, Chajogi, all of these different varieties. And I think here, because of the Latin nomenclature, and also just the nature of like these plants have gradually been getting more and more traction, I guess, to Western audiences, but it's always sort of known as shiso, the Japanese name for it, and all the other names that it's known by get seen as sort of synonyms. So it's just, oh, what does this community call shiso? What does that community call shiso? And that's fine, but it points to something dangerous in terms of just, that shortcoming in the hierarchy of language sometimes, which is that these plants aren't actually all the same. And we've, in fact, through language, conflated a group of plants into one sort of monolith. And if you look to East Asia, where these plants have much more kind of robust histories, they've been cultivated in places since the Bronze Age. They're some of the oldest domesticated crops, in parts of China and Korea, Japan and Thailand and Laos, Vietnam. And so there, Perilla is really broken out into like no less than 7 primary chemotypes that are really based on the distribution of different essential oils and the ratios of those essential oils. And this is important particularly because it's a really important medicinal crop. And so there's just a ton more research because of that long history. And so just so many more so much more of the diversity gets to be highlighted and really understood because it's had this multifaceted value to different communities. And so here you see a report from Korea that actually sequenced the Perilla genome and tried to look at different commonalities. And so most of the cultivated types that we enjoy for food or medicine are considered PA or PK types, and that just stands for perillaldehyde or perilla ketone, which are the primary kind of constituents in their makeup. And this is important not just for semantics, but you know, because it's a medicinal crop, this research has been really important to people just because if we were to conflate it, it would get very confusing from like a traditional medicine perspective because different varieties, because of those different essential oils are different in their efficacy in treating different ailments. And so in fact, because of this desire to really be clear from a materia medica point of view from doctors, there's been a lot more exploration of it. And I relate to this a lot just because for me as a Korean American, there's lots of times I hear friends talk about, you know, like, you know, their grandma or an auntie asking them for kinnip, and if they bring back the sort of curly leafed variety of Japanese shiso, you know, you're gonna get scolded basically. And I think people my age, like a lot of times just think of it as, yeah, that nationalistic pride. But it is in fact very wise because I love this plant because it tells such a distinct story of like the beauty of domestication as this process of mutual taming, where these plants, like just on a level of all these different oils and their morphology, like really became differentiated and really morphologically distinct in relationship to people and places that they encountered. And so whether people were choosing to eat the seeds, press the seeds into oil, use the leaves for a variety of things, you know, they have this real national character to them. Like I always say, if you're moving to a place and you want to make sure you connect with whatever Korean population is there, you should really plant this plant because it is a flagpole of sorts. And I think that there's something really beautiful about that, to just really know that even in all of these scientific journals and things, it's always really noted the particular social science aspect, which is the distinct kind of imprint and character that people have, the devotion they have to their variety of Perilla. And so I think it's hard now, like, to just know that as an introduction, if something is seen as exotic, without that full spectrum of information, it just gets very confusing to really parse out and keep varieties kind of true to what communities know them as. Or if you're going to blend them or breed new varieties, that's done intentionally and we're not just losing information without really understanding it. So that's kind of the first point we really wanted to make. And I feel like Perilla illustrates it, which is just, you know, how out of context we really lose important key parts of who these plants really are. So the next crop we're going to talk about is mustard green, which is another favorite crop of mine. And so a couple years ago, I had just been curious and I did a survey of different seed companies and different popular varieties of mustard greens, and what were the key words that were being used in describing them, and what could I glean in terms of what the desirable traits were from a culinary perspective. And the vast majority used those three words in the descriptor: mild, tender, and sweet. And the applications were listed as salad, raw, and stir fry. And this really tracks pretty consistently with what I know in terms of the kind of growth in the market for Asian vegetable seeds, and mustards being like a really big part of the growth of that industry, because it's really linked to the development of microgreen and baby leaf industries as well. And so a lot of the breeding priorities really revolve around, yeah, that tenderness, sweetness, because it's designed to be, yeah, eaten at the baby leaf stage. So a lot of the other traits that we see in mustards, like the coarse leaf, like a mild hairiness and things like that, are we're really moving away from. which is fine because that is part of what creates diversity. But when it's only seen as those are the only things we're really focusing on, I think that's another problem, because there's just so much in these different brassicas. And so we need like those different perspectives to maintain it. So we have a Korean variety that we developed from a wild weedy form in Korea. And we call it Cholado large leaf, because we developed it mostly for the purpose of kimchi, which is really a regional specialty in Cholado province, where our seeds originally came from. And so when we look at that, if you're making kimchi with something, you know, like the description we have of our mustard is pungent and spicy and coarse. But all of those things are really valuable attributes when you're making kimchi, because you need something that really stands up to the flavors of all those strong aromatics you're using. So all the alliums and the chili pepper and the ginger and the garlic. You want still like to know that underneath that there is something that also has its own flavor. So just wanted to talk about this as a way of saying that, you know, there's a way that the subjectivity and the distinct ways that people have learned to prepare something really informs what traits are valuable. And the things we interpret as flavor and texture and things like that are usually attached to lots of other traits genetically that are important in terms of like their agronomic value as well. And so another anecdote to share is just, you know, I was sitting once with a squash breeder from a bigger seed company, and she was talking about their process for culinary evaluations within their breeding program. And what they would do is just cube different types of winter squash, and they'd microwave it and then taste it. And I think that gave them this sense as scientific researchers of objectivity, and which is, you know, sort of this crowning goal, right, for a lot of this research. So having to prepare it in these particular ways is seen as something that is detrimental. Like they want something that's just under this sense of like being totally neutral. But when she was talking about it, she was saying that that was the justification for them to really devalue and discontinue them carrying a variety called Long Island cheese pumpkin, which is a very old heirloom that was stewarded by Northeastern indigenous people. And so it just evolved into kind of an interesting conversation about the fact that, well, obviously that plant didn't evolve to be microwaved. And there's lots of ways that it has historically been prepared, that the traits that maybe, you know, in that microwave form don't surface, but do surface when it's made into different types of stews and soups or pies. And so I think that this is all just to say, you know, that culinary wisdom is really necessary to kind of augment and give us a full sense of the story. And it shouldn't just be seen as something negative, that there's these really particular ways to prepare things, because in a lot of ways, those different ways that all of our ancestors had of transforming food, plants into different food and dishes and medicines is really so brilliant, and kind of just shows so much ingenuity. And again, those plants really respond to that. So those different preferences and things really take something like different forms of brassica that occur in the wild, and it just blows open their genetics, where it starts getting to evolve in all these interesting ways, because people treated it really different. And those preferences then came back as a repetitive selection pressure of just what they kept choosing, and the seeds that they were saving, and the plants that they found desirable. So yeah, just to make a case for the things that, you know, you might think sound objectively not great, but, you know, have merit, and it's worth exploring in terms of like a particular context and use. So the next crop we're going to look at is something that is really emblematic of Korean food and culture, although it is not native to the Korean peninsula. So it's the first crop we're looking at that is introduced and has a more sort of recent introduction into Korea. But for how relatively short it's been in use, it has made a huge impact and is so really iconic in terms of Korean food, and that's gochu, the chili pepper. And so it's believed to have been introduced, you know, in the 1600s. and has just really been embraced. And so for me, when I started my farm, a big part of it initially was that I was going to be contracted to grow Korean chili peppers because people couldn't find them locally, or they couldn't find them organically grown. And for a lot of people that are making kimchi and other types of food, they just feel like, oh, there's really no replacement for the way that that tastes. So this variety is an heirloom we call Lady Hermit, which is just a tribute to the seed steward of it. And it's an heirloom from Suncheon, which is, again, in Jeollado province in Korea, sort of on the southern tip. And it is an area that is really renowned for gochujang, which is the fermented pepper paste. So they have a fermented food festival, they have a chili pepper festival. So if you think of this crop that is like really beloved, and then you think of the region that is especially adamant about it, that is the story of this pepper and this region. And this variety was shared with me, and it was really bred over a very long period of time by peasants in that area. So not only for the flavor of gochujang, like the pepper itself is incredibly rich and it has this depth, and it's super earthy and really resonant and kind of smoky. So it really lends itself to that kind of like rich flavor of the pepper paste. But it was also really uniquely suited to the needs of farmers in that region, particularly, small scale peasant farmers. And so one of the most interesting facts is that it was actually developed to be direct seeded. So peppers, usually require a pretty long season of very favorable conditions and warm soil. And so usually you start them in a greenhouse several weeks before you're going to put them in the field. But for a lot of farmers in that region, they don't have the infrastructure or the capital to do things like that. So through just this kind of repeated trial and error, they found varieties that were able to be planted directly in the field in the spring, and then have two pretty high yielding turns of harvest seasons. And not only that these peppers just really thrived with, again, no added input, no fertilizer, nothing like that. So again, just stress test through this long history, really bred by peasants to be suited to thrive, not only in their climate, but in their sort of management systems and farming culture. And I say this because as great as this is, and as sort of distinctly tied to that area and being this chili pepper capital within the country, it's still not a variety that gets a ton of traction. It's a little bit smaller, so cosmetically it's not what people now anticipate seeing in the market. And farmers don't have as much incentive. And so, Korea, like lots of other places, has definitely experienced the influence of the sort of Green Revolution, the mentality and relationships in terms of like global trade. And so pepper, being just important economically, of course, has received more attention. And so now generally, like, people who are growing peppers on a commercial scale receive seeds that are seen as the best varieties for them from their local village, essentially agricultural extension or co-op. They're told the seeds that they grow, and then they can sell it back through like marketing co-ops, basically, for distribution within Korea and also export. So it's kind of interesting now, because of what the market demands. There weren't a lot of people that I met when I was in Korea working with these different farmers that wanted to grow this variety compared to the varieties that they knew they could sell, basically. And so the decision is happening downstream from them, from the markets, through their brokers, in terms of what's being sold. And, as you probably could guess, like, that's really attached to a lot of different farming regimens that are really chemical intensive, input intensive. So it's here that I just want to point out, in the 70s and 80s, amidst like extreme poverty, military dictatorship, tons of instability following Japanese colonization, then the Korean War, Syngenta was the largest investor in the Korean agricultural sector. And so pouring tons of money, giving farmers lots of different fertilizer and chemicals to use. And so just that sort of insidious nature of slipping that in during these periods of instability also allowed them to form a branch of their corporation in 1996. Two other biggest vegetable seed breeding companies, which are also really linked to chemical companies. So it does mirror what we see in the rest of the world where, you know, in the 80s and 90s, chemical companies step into the seed industry because you can kind of like really link those things, like seed that performs well when kind of coupled with all of these different things being manufactured as fertilizer and pest and disease deterrents and things like that. But in the 90s, Seminis, which, you know, then it becomes Monsanto, which becomes Bayer, acquired those two seed companies. And they acquired them actually for chili pepper genetic information, basically. And so at that time, Korean chili pepper breeders had come up with these interesting kind of elite breeding lines that had a trait called cytoplasmic male sterility. So essentially you create a male sterile parent line, and that expedites hybrid breeding exponentially because you are not emasculating the parent flower to create that hybrid seed, right? So essentially breeders there had come up with these interesting lines, and Seminis bought it just to acquire that intellectual property. So it's really interesting. Peppers really opened the door and shined this sort of global spotlight on what vegetable breeding was happening in Korea. And then sort of the dominoes all fell and there were all these number of acquisitions. And so a lot of Korean farmers, even farmers growing these higher yielding varieties or farmers that can't quite figure out how to make the economics of work for growing heirlooms, still really understood the implications of the peppers that they're growing. Not only that every, you know, seed that they buy, the royalty is paid to these big multinationals that they see as a threat to food sovereignty and food security in Korea, but also just the sort of like breeding mentalities of those companies, being very vertical and being very focused on like different single traits for yield and flavor and things like that. Aren't necessarily the most resilient or adapted to, again, the climate in the areas they're being grown, nor are they adapted to, the cultural practices of those farmers, right? Because with these multinational companies, it becomes a global business where the grow outs of those seed lots and the development of it is happening all over the world, usually wherever labor is the cheapest. So this sort of local seed resource ceases to be very locally adapted or locally useful. So that's kind of the threats really presented. And so part of the uphill battle is also, these are some seed packs and then these different packaged food products made with what's called Chongyong peppers, which is now like very popular. There's been a huge marketing push for it, and it's like a really recognized name. Like we get asked about it a ton about growing Chongyong peppers. And essentially that's like a group of peppers that have been bred for like a higher spice level than a lot of the more traditional Korean chili peppers. It's a Korean pepper cross with a Southeast Asian variety of pepper. And so it's interesting because this is seen as, kind of the culinary favorite at this point. So here we have this notion, even though through the rest of my talk, it's about the importance of those culinary preferences and how it's related to culture. But now you have it kind of awash because of this very top-down system, where this is really seen as the sort of iconic Korean pepper. And so farmers that want to grow these other varieties, traditional varieties, really have no traction in the market. And so I think it's a little bit of both of, and I think it's just a fertile question, I guess, that chili peppers bring up. And for me, that question is around a lot of things about authenticity, like what, for people to get so amped up over it, what is a Korean pepper? Like, what are we talking about, especially when pepper now connects Korea to all of these other sort of big global forces, a crop that's not native to it. Like, what does make it Korean? And I think that that's just you know, possibly a bigger sort of existential threat. And it's led to a lot of interesting conversations to be trusted with this heirloom and try to really champion it. And then, yeah, what the notion is and how does that contrast, and what parts of a story are we telling are traditional. And I think it's useful in that because it sort of, it points to the fallibility of the notion of just something being like wholly authentic or just purely traditional in a very static way. So for that, I'm really grateful. It's led to a lot more murkiness and questions to really ask ourselves, like, well, what makes this pepper Korean? So it's just sort of an interesting thing to think about. And it also gives me a way to move from talking about just purely the enjoyment and the traits that we experience through consuming the plants to talking about also the fact that as farmers, we're looking for, you know, traits that are going to work well and be resilient for the future, and how we adapt those traits to our different contexts and to our farms. So for us, the real key is what we consider horizontal resilience. And it's based on that notion of contrasting breeding methodologies. Like what I talked about with peppers is the idea of vertical resistance, which is like, say, a disease like fusarium wilt. A lot of breeding will look at identifying what gene or two genes are responsible for resistance to fusarium wilt. And they will just kind of find parent lines that have those genes and use that to breed. Whereas horizontal resistance looks at something not being wholly immune to a disease, but things that when exposed to it have a number of things going on, a number of different traits that interact to make the plant less susceptible. And in that, rather than focusing on a pure immunity, just on a pure gene level, but looking at kind of a more robust overall dynamic way for a plant to weather those stresses and diseases a little bit better. And so we think about that too in terms of like the type of horizontalist resistance we see in terms of like collective and collaborative movements. So we really want to focus on traditional breeding and selection and things that just involve a community, things that go wide, things that really involve a lot of people. And so not focus on just singular genes in any regard. And it also, like, to kind of highlight it, is thinking about, like, you know, someone like Monsanto develops a lot of drought resistance in corn, predominantly through, you know, identifying there's two genes that control RNA transfer during periods of drought. And so they genetically modify that gene bundle essentially to create these drought resistant varieties. And if you contrast that with things like Hopi varieties of corn and beans and things that are drought resistant through these long expanses of time and adapting slowly to like this evolving climate, and also developing in relationship to like the wisdom of the Hopi people and the ways that their agronomic practices were, you have something that's just more robust in terms of just the variety of challenges, because stressors and things don't come in that very linear way. And so just thinking about this horizontal resilience really equipping us for maximizing how many different types of things can go wrong, essentially. And then we also just want to be decentralized in our approach. So we work with lots of different growers in different types of climates to just try to safeguard all our seeds, to try to protect this resource so that these different lines can experience these different types of environments and possibilities, and just learn and adapt and grow. So one example we can give is we did a project with two varieties of eggplant. So on the left is a variety called Kamo, which is a traditional Kyoto heirloom vegetable from Japan. And then on the right is a variety called Pingtung Red, which is a Taiwanese heirloom variety of eggplant. And essentially what we wanted to do was to just essentially improve them for heat and drought resistance, which are our two biggest selection pressures, of course, where we are, and just things that more communities are dealing with overall. And so what we did was a trial for 5 years where essentially we grew, let's say, 4 rows for our market. And we kind of just grew them the way we would just to harvest the fresh market produce. and we'd replicate that with 4 rows that were stressed rows. So we essentially just expose them to more stress through giving them less water. So however much water we gave the market rows, we would give the stress rows like at least half or less than that. And we give them no extra supplemental fertility, no compost tea, nothing like that. And so essentially the goal was to create an environment where at least 50% of the population would be severely impacted and possibly die, so that we could see like what survives with those stresses when lots of the rest of the population are not withstanding it. And even though I couldn't articulate on a genetic level what was happening, I would just repeatedly save seeds from those plants that were more robust. And over the course of those 5 years, the gap started decreasing, where pretty soon you couldn't tell the difference between what we were coddling and what we weren't. And so now we can just grow those varieties under the sort of more stressful conditions, giving them less water, not giving them extra fertilizer, and they just thrive. And so that's purely just on-farm plant breeding, essentially, done in a very traditional way. So even though it was rather miserable, essentially creating a eggplant hell realm for half of that population, it was also remarkable to see in a span of just a few years that we had something that really worked for our farming system, rather than having to maintain the inputs of different types of fertility and water, which are, pretty impactful in terms of small farms' bottom line. And so it's another thing when we think of, a lot of farms that I worked at when I was younger, we didn't really save a lot of our own seeds because for the most part, a lot of seed is pretty cheap. And seed doesn't constitute like necessarily a huge line item for a lot of farms compared to the time and space it takes up to prioritize that seed saving. So if you think of something, I worked at a lettuce farm, and a head of lettuce is ready to harvest in 45 days. So very quick turnaround can be very productive when you're just churning out lots of rotations. Lettuce seed is taking several months. And every plant you let go to seed is a head of lettuce that you're not harvesting. So the economic incentive, like a lot of farmers just didn't see how that would pencil out. Not only leave a portion of your field, where especially in California, every square foot, people are thinking of how to monetize because land access is so expensive. So yeah, to think about that compared to buying like, 2 packs of lettuce seed, which are going to get you through like so much of the season, being $4, it doesn't necessarily make sense. But for us, like if you think about just the whole package of what comes, not just the physical seed, but also if you have varieties that are really suited to your farming system and what you aspire to do in your farming system, then you start seeing really impactful outcomes, right? Because water is super expensive. Fertilizer is very expensive. So if you're able to work on your farm to develop varieties where those items fall from your expenditures, then I think it starts to get some attention that is worthwhile. So those were kind of some of the crops that I felt like just helped me illustrate like different parts or have taught me something in terms of just shaping my accountability of how I care for these plants, and what it kind of makes me think about in terms of like what my contract is with those plants and how I grow them. But we want to just talk now about, well, what does that look like in practice? Like, what is the reality of these things? Like, how do we hold that perspective of how culture informs it? And how do we make sure that culture does inform it? And so I know a big focus of what this lecture series is talking about is contrasting the idea of ex situ and in situ conservation, and clearly like why things like Svalbard are, are being met right now with a little bit more critical eye in terms of just the pace of climate chaos and its impacts and the severity, and how much more people are thinking about it. Even people who have a lot of privilege and are insulated from feeling the effects, I think more and more people are noticing the violence of it. And so recognizing that this sort of in situ conservation practices where plants get to experience this changing world in real time and develop and learn and, you know, build their own knowledge and figure out how to evolve and adapt is quite meaningful. And for us in situ, I think especially we're working with all different communities across the Asian diaspora. And for a lot of our communities, there's a lot of things that have informed the displacement from our different ancestral lands. And so we're growing these varieties that aren't in situ in their original context, but we hold in situ to mean in context and in a sense of right relationship. So we look to keep it in that right relationship or restore it to a place of that relationship by keeping it in community, and also just really building our capacity within a community to care for those plants that have cared for us. So that is really the heart and the imperative of what we feel like we're trying to do as a project through second generation. And so some of the ways we do that are to work in collaboration with other growers. So we build a growers network to just develop English language or multilingual resources that still come from an Asian American perspective. So perspectives that really know, and again, like hold the whole being of a plant, and also are able to kind of couple that with the specific agricultural wisdom of how these plants have been grown and different management practices that are specific. And then also just wanting to widen that conversation and bring in other parts of our community when food is so essential to so much of how people connect to their ancestry and their heritage, to just bring seed into that conversation around cultural foodways. And so we've started different programs to try to think about what does it look like for everyone to be a seed steward. So part of what we're doing is we built a program that works with farmers through the year, where we highlight different crops and we talk about their context. We work with different partner organizations and chefs, community advocates, to kind of, pitch to different parts of the facets of that crop and how it's significant. And then we also work using the CSA model, subscription box format, where all of our CSA groups come together and share recipes with one another, and just create this kind of robust, interesting dialogue. So last year we piloted a program, and I worked with a cohort of Korean, Filipino, and Vietnamese families to kind of just from this perspective of looking at like what all our communities have experienced and certain things that are hard to talk about around just like the role of militarism and colonialism in our respective countries and how that's impacted our communities, how it shaped our experience in the US. So we want to do that through food. So we worked with these families, and all of the families are households that have kids that are between the ages of 4 and 10. And so we really wanted to focus, on these particular communities, want to focus some programming directly to young people, some to our elders and engage them, and then to college students, because elders and college students also represent portions of our communities that experience food insecurity at a pretty significant rate. So we tailor different parts of our program to those different groups. So for us, we're about preserving, perpetuating, and evolving tradition. So just knowing that none of these things need to stay static or we don't need to think about just replicating them in perpetuity, but to give ourselves permission of how do we evolve it, because that's what we can take from plants, is that plants want to change and things should be allowed to change as long as it's kind of held with that respect and reverence. So a lot of the focus is on reconnecting, remembering all of the different traditions and doing that in this sort of collaborative nature. We want to focus again on intergenerational and cross-cultural dialogue. So we just create these clearinghouses where people submit recipes, share their different stories. We have templates for telling those stories or doing community interviews. And this also just helps us in terms of like the logistics load of running a CSA for a small farm, just because if somebody is less familiar with a crop that's in their box, someone else within the CSA membership is probably really familiar and actually really loves that crop. And it really helps, we found, for people to just be willing to try something that maybe they don't like if they just were trying to wing it and figure out how to use it. But when you hear something that's couched in all of these stories and memories and sentimentality and nostalgia, it just stays with you. It's like anytime, you know, like a friend shares something that's like tender and personal, it just, yeah, it just makes you want to like something a little bit more. And so the thing that I've really loved is, particularly with young people, that's been the big feedback from the parents or caregivers, is that, you know, in a CSA, if something was unfamiliar, they might just get rid of it in a box, right? Because a CSA is a little bit of a crapshoot. But because it was really couched in this and people were seeing all of these things come through their email and in our virtual potlucks that we held, people were just getting excited because it was like, yeah, getting let in on a secret from somebody else, or just being told, you know, how important this plant is to other people. So we saw kids embracing things that their parents were just really surprised by, but things like bitter melon, like especially like, yeah, bitter flavors, strong, spicy flavors, you know, just were more embraced because someone was saying, hey, yeah, I really love that. And this is how I love to prepare it. So you just got all these delicious iterations and guidance on how to use something so you experience it kind of at its peak. And so we also just wanted to use this to build really practical skills and share our love of science. So just each virtual potluck that we held 2 monthly. There would always be a portion that was sort of a science lesson. And it was really talking about, like for us, like one of our sessions focused on Korean ehobak, which is a type of summer squash, essentially. And it's really dense and it's really sweet. And of course, Korean people think it's just more delicious because it's Korean, but it's actually just a different species of squash than a lot of typical zucchinis. And so it's just the dry matter is different, the starch conversion is different. So there's something very particular about why it is so unique. And so we try to just teach a lot about the botany, and from that perspective to just talk about like the decisions and how do we match up like what we find to be interesting and how we then, it helps shine a light on what's interesting about it at a plant level. So yeah, we teach seed saving workshops, we do hands-on things. And last year, of course, yeah, just did everything virtually. So this is just an example of some of the content. We have a crop interview template that just really asks the young people in the group to find somebody who is familiar with one of the crops in their boxes and kind of can tell you what it's historically been used for, how they would describe the flavor, how they use it, and then also why they think it's sort of so special and particular to their community. And so it's just been great to have this crowdsourced information as well to kind of just help provide a prompt where a lot of people, especially like the people my age, like the people who are, you know, parents or caregivers to these kids, to say like, oh, these are things that I've always wanted to know or have been reluctant or haven't come up naturally with, you know, like my parents or grandparents. And because of this program, it's been able to kind of have just something spark some of those conversations. So even though some of it is being directed to the group, there's just been a lot of ways that it's surfaced a lot of conversations that then families have, just individually, people have kind of in their more insular communities, and that's part of the goal as well. And yeah, I just love seeing kind of the information that comes out of it. Just about like the perspective. So it's useful for me too, as a seed saver, to kind of see that. And so that basically wraps it up. Thank you all for listening to all of those stories. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can find our website, secondgenerationseeds.com. You can email us or find us on the old Instagram. But thanks again for listening. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the lectures.